Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you very much. This is Doug. Glad to be back with you here with my good friend Cody. Cody, you ready to rock and roll today?
Man, let's do this. Wrath of God, part 2 of part something of the whole series.
Yeah. We opened up the Wrath of God thing last week, and we've got more that we need to delineate and parse through here today. It's good stuff.
So, for our listeners, we're walking through Romans 9, 10, and 11. Your dad wrote a book on it. Just a reminder. It's called Irrevocable. Romans 9, specifically the last part of it, so verses 19 through 33, spends a good portion of the time talking about being objects of wrath that are made for destruction. What if God desiring to show his wrath, verse 22. And so we took last week and we talked a little bit about these two words, wrath and reward. And what I want to do in this episode is I want to talk more about wrath and reward, but I want to talk briefly about the role and function of wrath. So we talked a little bit last week about how we define that as inevitably being like a metaphor for the natural consequences of selfish source. So here's where I want to get in. I want to dive into that and what that looked like then, but then what we would call it now. Okay.
Sure.
So even now, people use that language, not much, but this is the wrath of God. Okay. So I want to talk about that. We'll get into Mother Nature. I want to talk about punishment, and then let's bring up Satan because he's,
troublemaker.
Yes, he is. So let's talk about that. Now, let's start with just briefly the role and function of wrath. Why is it that it's continually threaded throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, and Paul's writing here in chapter 9 specifically? What is he getting at with wrath? Why is it there? What does it exist for? Does it have a role in now that we know what it is, inevitably being consequences, a metaphor of the consequences of our own actions?
Yes.
Why is that even there? And what's the cause of it? And then, of course, we'll push that right to today, which is inevitable consequences of our own actions, of numerous things, not taking care of the planet. On and on and on and on and on the list goes, that there are inevitable consequences for our actions right now. Because it's important to say this, we're not, I almost want to say obviously, but our listeners probably don't know this. We're not throwing out good works.
No, not at all.
We're actually saying it's very important. It's just, it naturally flows from what we call the fruit of the Spirit. Which is when God is source.
Yes.
And we're not operating out of a selfish source.
No.
We talked a lot about that last week.
Our good works become basically a manifestation of our nature. It's just the way we are. It's just like an apple tree producing apples. It's just the way it is.
And I think that's a good point, by the way. You say one line and I'm like, we got to talk about it.
Okay.
But that's a good point, even when you start talking about the DNA of the human species, because we're talking about God identity here.
Yes.
But for many of us, we've all been sold this lie that we are dirty, rotten, wretched humans at our core.
Yeah,
and we have a sinful nature. We're broken from the start. So some have called this original sin or whatever.
Right.
And when you talk about good works as a manifestation from who we are, when at a very early age, psychologically speaking, kids are told they're absolute garbage and that God sees them as sinful people.
Right.
Well, then don't be surprised when inevitably what is manifested is what you've told them who they are.
Yes, that's exactly the way it is with all of us. Whatever we think, that's what we are. Perception is reality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is why what Paul is writing 2,000 years ago is a universal document for all human beings who share these very same principles and thoughts and struggles and challenges. And again, when you get into the Gentile situation, Cody, of saved, lost, it's that either or thinking. And so what most people think is either I'm going to see myself in this story as all the good people, or if you got a real guilt complex, you'll see yourself as the bad people and hope that nobody really knows who you are inside because you'd be shamed and humiliated. But really what the narrative is saying is there's two aspects to the human being. There's an aspect of us that has an instinctive self, and that sometimes we allow the instinctive self to be in control of all that we do, think, and act on. But we also are spirit as source, that we are God-breathed. We're created in God's image, and that we act through spirit to find those things that are going to bring fruits of the Spirit. And so I'm all of that. I'm on some days Pharaoh, on other days I may be Father Abraham and his faith. And so I'm all of that. The same is true with the wrath and the reward. What the narrative is showing here is the basis upon which we can expect wrath or unworkable consequences in our life, and the basis on which I can expect rewarding things to happen in my life, the basis on which I can have a more abundant life versus a life that I am now facing in some type of pain or struggle that will inevitably be an indicator that there's something I'm doing through my own self-centeredness or my own self-choices that bringing about that wrath or that unworkable or those consequences, but I'm all of it. And the temptation of the human is always to do an either or. I'm either saved or lost. I'm either good or evil. And I'm either under the wrath or I'm getting the reward. And I'm either one or the other. But an integral approach is a wholeness approach that says, let's understand we're all of this. We're all of it. Let's quit pretending. Let's quit being...
Or we manifest all that.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
I was thinking about even as I watch like different movies or shows or whatever, how quick... Think about this the next time you watch a show or a movie. How quick are you to resonate with one or the other? Because in all storylines, there's usually an evil human and there's a good human. There's the devil and there's the angel.
Yeah.
And how quick are we to resonate with one or the other? I actually think that's what Jesus does so well in a lot of the parables he shares. Because it's almost as if he's just fishing out there going, now, do you find yourself in these stories?
Yeah.
And where do you find yourself?
Yes.
And oftentimes, what's so surprising about his parables is when you're like, well, I find myself with the righteous individual. Right. It's the righteous one that he throws down, like under the bus.
Exactly.
Because it's the shock, it's the surprise to be like, yeah, and that's actually the problem here. That's what we need to talk about.
And that's what Paul's going to do to the Gentiles when he gets to chapter 11, because they're identifying all through 9 and 10 that they are the ones who are God's righteous. They are the ones who through faith and belief are the saved. And so when Paul spells all this out, they're thinking, yeah, you're going right down the track with us. This is why we're saved and why they're lost, till you get to 11:1 where he goes, nope, certainly not.
And we went through a season where people were bragging about how awful they were too. I don't know if you remember that, but it was like, it would be like Twitter headers and Facebook descriptions of themselves, like wretched sinner. Yeah. Hey, if it weren't for God, you know what I mean? And it was kind of that like, wait, the ego also works that way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the ego can feel good out of either being a victim or a hero. But again, those are natural inclinations that we have. And the narrative is trying to help all of us to understand our true nature and all of what makes us what we are. So, yeah, you've got wrath of God in this, and wrath of God does have a role and function.
Okay. As wrath being a metaphor for the natural consequences of our actions when self is source and is in the driver's seat. Wrath of God then is, so we can use that language. Let's just call it, because that's what Paul calls it.
Yeah.
So it's fine. Call it wrath. Why then is it still there? What is the, I guess I would even word it like this, is there a role and function to wrath? And what is that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I would say to that. First of all, I would start in the story with the role and function of wrath in the last days, which is that period of time from the cross till when Jerusalem is destroyed. So you have two symbols, the cross and the city of Jerusalem.
Now, and that's assuming our listeners know, and you can go back and listen. A whole series.
I was going to say, hopefully, I'm assuming you've listened to past podcasts.
Yes, because if you're just joining us, you'll be like, whoa,
what's he talking about?
Yes.
So in the last days, you have two things being revealed. You have a group of people that are revealing what it means to be unbelieving, hard-hearted, like Saul, and some in Israel. Others in Israel represent faith and what it means to be pursuing those things which bring reward. And so both of those are being played out and revealed in the last days. So both of those have a role and function. I need to understand how both of those end up with specific consequences. In fact, it's interesting, Cody, when John the Baptist is on the scene before Jesus appears, he's out in the wilderness, and some of the Pharisees go out to investigate what he's up to and what's this wild man saying out there. And when he sees them, he says, "You brood of vipers, who has warned you to flee from the coming wrath?" And so John the Baptist opens up this idea of wrath in the very beginning. Well, then Jesus carries it on further when Jesus says to them, "You do not understand the time of your visitation. You do not understand that someday that you're going to wail and that people are going to die in the streets of this city because you did not understand the one who came to warn you of this coming wrath." And then, of course, you're going to have the writers in the New Testament, like Paul, when he wrote to the Thessalonians, before he wrote to the Romans. Paul tells the Thessalonians that the people in Jerusalem and Judea were filling up the measure of God's wrath through their disobedience and hard-hearted rejection of God and the work of God through Christ. And so this wrath is building up. What is that wrath? The wrath is that which removes all things that stand in the way of understanding true self or true God identity.
Pause.
That's the role and function.
Pause.
Okay.
Okay. I want to attempt to repeat what you just said. The wrath of God, as it's used, then is revealed as that which removes those things that stand in the way of our God identity.
Yes, absolutely. And Cody, we all believe that in every other aspect of this human existence. And I'll give two examples. You brought it up that we're going to talk about this. I'll throw it in right now, and that's Mother Nature. Mm-hmm. All of us know, we watch Nat Geo or Discovery or Science Channel, and we all know that there's this thing called the wrath of Mother Nature. Mm. There's no one that sits around and says how disgusted they are with Mother Nature because she has wrath. No one says, "Oh, Mother Nature, no." In fact, we understand the nature of Mother Nature. And so what is this wrath of Mother Nature? If you're talking about something like a forest fire, I'll use that as an example. If you're talking about a forest fire, the purpose of that forest fire is to burn all the dead trees, all the dead wood, all of the vines and thistles and thorns and weeds that have grown up in the forest that are preventing the forest from having further growth. When that fire occurs, then you end up with the removal of all of that, and what's left provides the groundwork, if you will, for future growth for a more abundant, healthier forest. And that is the purpose of the wrath of Mother Nature. The wrath of Mother Nature is telling us in many places what we have done to the environment is having consequences that are detrimental to all life on the planet. Well, that's the wrath of Mother Nature. It serves a necessary role and function. And when we're talking about from a spirit standpoint, Jerusalem is used as an external example of what happens when you put your trust in a doing system. And that doing system was a religion. It was a religion that had a temple, it had a high priest, it had a priesthood. It was based on doing, and law. And that is what God said had to be removed so that we humans have to understand, look, our nature is already the identity of God. And it is not going to be based on the things that we do. And so the wrath of God, as outlined by Jesus in his prophecies about Jerusalem, as outlined by Paul when he talked to the Thessalonians about the wrath coming, Peter spoke of the same thing. The elements are going to melt, this fire. Fire becomes a purging purpose, role, and function. So Mother Nature is one. The second is parenting. Danae and I have raised this blended family of 4 kids. We now have the grandkids. Well, any parent knows that part of raising a child is the use of some sort of punishment. And that punishment, of course, even there, what the wrath of a parent was 100 years ago is quite different than what we teach today. There's very few parents today that will get a switch or a belt, and use that as part of the punishment. But that's what parents thought, in earlier times of consciousness. Today, we do things that start with taking, you got to take a time out, or we take something away from them, or we deny them of something. So what is the purpose of that punishment? Is it that we put a period at the end and we say, you're going to do something, and I'm just going to make sure that the rest of your existence as you know it is going to be in punishment? And there's not going to be anything other than punishment, because as your parent, my main goal is to find out, am I going to put you under punishment for the rest of your existence, or are you going to do the right thing so that you can be my child? Well, we don't do that either, obviously, and I'm using ridiculous examples, Cody, but the point of it is the same point as the narrative. The only time you get into wrath or punishment, etc., as something that becomes an eternal destination of identity is when you talk religion. When you talk parenting, when you talk Mother Nature, when you talk about other aspects of life, it makes no sense. But it was set up this way from the earliest times, way back to when people thought that the volcano god burned everybody up on the island because of something they did. Those kinds of thinkings and consciousness, if you will, have been passed all the way through and brought into this idea of religion. And that is why the narrative, and Paul's writing here specifically, is attempting to correct the Gentiles on that very thinking.
Woo! Take a breath.
I need a drink.
So the metaphor, I was thinking while you were talking about like fire as a symbol of the wrath, because oftentimes when you see in the text about the wrath of God, beside it, you do see this symbol of fire. And even as you mentioned, the elements melt like snow or whatever. That's I can't tell you how many times that text has been used totally out of its context. But I was thinking about, even in an external way, how in 70 AD, this temple comes down and they set fire to this. That's just a wild image to think about, that the entire structure and system of doing and grasping and kicking and the rewards and punishment and heaven and hell and all of that it's like the divine's like, let's just burn all that up.
Yeah.
Let's burn it all up.
That's it exactly.
And some would call that the wrath of God. Now, I want the pendulum to swing to the other side, because my charismatic Pentecostal brothers and sisters would say, well, we don't really call that the wrath of God. And that's fine. Even when you talk about punishment, again, it's a metaphor like the wrath of God is.
Sure.
But I want the pendulum to swing to the other side, because they would be like, yeah, we don't inevitably see necessarily these horrendous things that happen to us as consequences of our actions. Sometimes they are, but they would go the other way, Doug, and say, and we don't even see that as the wrath of God. God's a good God. God is love. But we know what it is. It's Satan. And they see Satan as an actual, probably on some levels, a spirit, but on some levels, a male. Mm-hmm. And it has an external form to it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's definitely an individual. And you get to like Romans 16, which is ahead of us. Mm-hmm. Paul said this: the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet.
Yes. Okay.
For those that would say, yeah, but these consequences, these things are from Satan.
Right. Yes.
Thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's interesting that this God of peace was going to crush Satan shortly, because Paul earlier in chapter 13 says that our salvation is nearer than we first believed. You should know the time. The time is short. These things are at hand. All of these things are, again, showing that there's a time frame that all of this is happening in the first century. They're not things that are put out here into our future. Secondly, we've already talked about the fact that Satan, the word Satan, comes from a root that means adversary. And we've seen that this adversarial consciousness or adversarial mind starts with Adam and Eve in the garden. It's described in terms of it being a snake. And we have in past podcasts pointed out that in our minds, this satanic force, if you will, is the adversarial mind of our reptilian stem, which attempts through selfish source to control everything we do through its instincts. So when you're talking about the God of peace, how does peace come? How do I have peace in my life? I will not have peace in my life if I think that it's up to me to make sure that I'm going to be good with God. I will go to my deathbed, perhaps known as a great leader in my particular denomination, a great person, but I'll lie on that deathbed, as many have, and I'll be terrified, because there's a lot of things about me that the people in my denomination just don't know. There's a lot of things about me that I've got in the closet, so to speak. And I know that I've been telling everyone that what I do is I live this good, quote, faithful life, and I'm concerned, I'm worried, I have fear. That is not at all the story of the narrative, and no one should have to go to their dying days with that kind of fear in their lives. But it all comes back to the fact that people are, in that sense, then seeking reward on the basis of what they do. And there isn't a person alive that wouldn't question whether they deserve such a reward. Now we can get to a place where we say, well, no, because I accepted Jesus, I know that I've got all these things, but God forgives my things. God doesn't forgive other people's things. Why? Because they didn't do what I have done. Well, what did you do? And then there's denominational rules that are different depending on where you go to church that will tell you what you have to do in order to be on the saved versus on the lost side of things. But that reward thing is, it's a big part of the story. It's just, in my mind, not used as much as the punitive side, because when you're dealing with control over people, fear always is a more powerful motivator.
And for those that might be a little confused, as you talked about the reptilian stem, the snake, the Satan as it's used, you see that as metaphorical. And what we mean is there's a reason these sources and writers portray something like a Satan, is because it is symbol, because in order to understand the invisible or the formless, sometimes it needs some sense of form.
Yes. I mean, how else do you talk? It's why Jesus used parables. The kingdom is like. And so Jesus will use metaphors, parables. The kingdom of God is within. It always starts with an actual physical form, like the kingdom of Israel. There's an actual temple, and then pretty soon God dwells in our heart, and our heart becomes the temple. When you enter that realm of formlessness, which again we've talked about in past podcasts, then you have to use language that's symbolic. And this is also something that's handed down naturally for the last 2,000 years, and that is the way people have taken things literally. They literally think that Satan has the pitchfork, is this person roaming the earth looking for his next victim today, or you think that the kingdom of God is something that's going to be set up here on earth as an actual literal kingdom, and I could go on and on and on. That is why they do use this. But this adversary that we have is the adversary that keeps us awake at 2 a.m. It's the adversary that bothers us in our lives about what's happening in our lives. And am I loved and truly accepted by God? Am I actually going to be rejected because, man, I know who I am, and I know I'm this, and I know I'm that? This is the adversary that is being destroyed, and it's the adversary that's trying to tell you that you're anything less than God's own.
Okay. And as we kind of wind this thing down, I want to bring it down to our listeners in like a real pragmatic type life scenario. If we're saying the wrath of God is that which removes those things that stand in the way of our God identity. But just recently, I'll give one example. I am talking with an acquaintance as a pastor. I have sometimes like all kinds of people that come to me with their stuff. And by stuff, inevitably, it generally is the consequences of actions. And a lot of those conversations recently have been about marriage and long-term relationships and divorce and all that kind of stuff. And I was just sitting with someone not long ago, and her husband left her, and she was just distraught. And she was talking about all the things that are there, and she's deep into this, right? I mean, we're talking weeds every which way. And I didn't say this outright to her, but I had this thought like, I know this feels like the worst day of your life. And no one's taking that pain away. And some of you listeners may be in that space right now. Like, this is awful. No one's taking that away. In fact, what you need is not even a solution. It's not like I have like a 3-step solution for you. I really believe in those moments, solidarity is what is needed. But I had this thought that I know this is the worst day of your life, but it's also a giant step forward for you, because what you have now is all the things that are underneath are actually surfacing, which to me is like the first step towards healing, because you can't heal what you don't acknowledge. And at least now it's in the air and it's floating around and you're acknowledging it. But the point is that even those moments are opportunities for us to move into new stages of consciousness. And in some ways, you can call that the wrath of God. In some ways, you can call that the consequences of selfish source. But as you're saying, all those things are in our lives to remove those things that stand in the way of our God identity. This is a moment of like massive education in all of us that we walk through stuff. We can view it either way, but the reality is perhaps those unworkable, which is where you started the podcast, moments, those moments of utter tragedy sometimes. My experience has been, when I look back, I can name like 2 of the most painful moments of my life have now been 2 of the most moments that were catalyst for massive further growth in my life as well. And I would say it's stripping away all the lies that I believed about who I was. And you start to realize, oh, this lady, she isn't just a mom. She isn't just a spouse. She isn't just, because when you take all that stuff away, you're taking away identity until everything's stripped, to the point that when we are on our deathbed, the final form, this flesh and blood, is also taken away from us.
That's it.
And we begin to realize who we have always been, not because we've done a single thing.
Yes.
This is who we've always been.
Yes. And there now you have framed, using what we might call wrath, unworkable pain, suffering, whatever. We have used it for the purpose of growth rather than choosing to simply be a victim of it. And I can be a victim of it by simply taking on guilt and spending the rest of my life in a guilt and shame mode, rather than being able to understand, wait a minute, the purpose of all things in life, all the things you experience, is so that you can use them to go forward in a better basis. So this is all part of Romans 9. We're also going to get into chapter 10 and chapter 11 later and ferret out even more that Paul is getting at here.
All right. Well, there's our contribution to the wrath of God. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.